My father called me 6 times before midnight that Christmas. I ignored the first 5. On the 6th, he left a voicemail, and the man who had spent my entire childhood acting as if asking for help was a character defect sounded almost frightened. "Marissa, please call me back. Please. Undo this." I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, still wearing the dark green sweater I had put on that morning for Christmas at my parents' house. On the screen, one line in our company's internal finance workflow had changed from ready for submission to CFO certification pending. I stared at it, listened to my father's message again, and thought about how strange it was that 12 hours earlier he had been telling me I was ruining Christmas over a few presents. Before I tell you how we got from a pile of gifts under my parents' tree to my father begging me to reverse something before midnight, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what happened that Christmas turned out to be about much more than presents, and some of the smallest details that morning mattered far more than I understood at the time. And if you enjoy stories about families, betrayal, and the moment someone finally decides enough is enough, subscribe to the channel and stay with me through the rest of this one. That morning, Sophie and I left our house a little after 9. She was 11, old enough to recognize tension but still young enough to get excited when she saw a gift tag with her name on it. My parents lived about 40 minutes away on the other side of Columbus, and by the time we reached their neighborhood, Sophie had already asked twice whether Grandma had remembered the watercolor set she had put on her wish list. I told her I had no idea. What I did not tell her was that my mother had asked me for that list 2 weeks earlier and had been unusually specific about colors, sizes, and brands. My parents' house looked exactly the way Susan Clark believed Christmas should look. White lights wrapped the porch columns. Garland framed the front door. Inside, cinnamon and coffee hung in the warm air. Christmas music played quietly from the living room, and the tree was surrounded by enough wrapped boxes to make a department store jealous. My younger sister Allison was already there with her 3 children. Sophie stopped when she saw the tree, because several packages near the front had her name written across the tags in my mother's careful handwriting. For a few minutes, everything felt almost normal. Susan hugged Sophie. James kissed the top of her head, and Allison's kids were already sorting presents into little piles. I noticed my mother's phone propped horizontally on a shelf facing the tree. That did not strike me as strange at first. Susan recorded birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, graduations, and practically any family event she thought might look good in a video later. I assumed she wanted footage of the grandchildren opening gifts, so I took off my coat, helped Sophie with hers, and forgot about the phone. Then my mother picked up the first package with Sophie's name on it. It was a long box wrapped in silver paper. Sophie leaned forward slightly because she recognized the shape. Susan read the tag, looked at Sophie, and then turned toward Allison's oldest child. "This one will be perfect for you," she said. She handed it across the room. Sophie's smile disappeared so quickly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Susan picked up another box. Sophie's name was on that one too. She handed it to Allison's youngest. Then a third went to the middle child. Nobody laughed as if it were a joke. Nobody said the tags had been mixed up. Allison looked down at the floor, and James stood near the fireplace with both hands around his coffee mug, as though none of this required explanation. I waited until my mother reached for a 4th package. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice even, "are those Sophie's gifts?" Susan looked directly at me. There was no embarrassment on her face and no confusion. She gave me a small smile, the kind she used whenever she believed she was about to explain something obvious to someone difficult. "The tags don't matter," she said. "These are for our real grandkids." Sophie did not cry. That made it worse. Her hands went completely still at her sides, and she stared at the carpet as if concentrating hard enough on one spot might keep everyone from seeing her face. I remember the pressure in my jaw before I remember feeling angry. My mother had asked for my daughter's wish list. She had bought those gifts knowing exactly who wanted them. She had written Sophie's name on them herself. Whatever this was, it was not an accident. Before I said another word, my father stepped in. "Marissa, calm down." I looked at him. "I am calm." Susan sighed. "Please don't make a scene in front of the children." That was when something shifted in my mind. Neither of them was responding to what I was doing. They were responding to something they seemed to expect me to do. I had not raised my voice. I had not touched a gift. I had asked one question, yet my father was already telling me to calm down and my mother was warning me not to make a scene. My eyes moved past them to the shelf. The phone was still there. Its camera faced the exact area between the tree and the couch where I was standing. Allison saw me look at it. Her eyes flicked toward our mother for half a second, then away. She said nothing. I did not know yet what that silence meant, but I knew enough not to give anyone the performance they appeared to be waiting for. I walked to the entryway and picked up Sophie's coat. "Come on, sweetheart." James set down his coffee. "You're leaving?" "Yes." "Over presents?" His voice sharpened. "You're going to ruin Christmas over presents?" I helped Sophie into her coat and zipped it because her fingers were trembling. "This isn't about the presents." Susan folded her arms. "Then what is it about?" I looked at her, then at the phone, then back at Sophie. I could have said 100 things. I could have reminded my mother that Sophie was every bit as much their granddaughter as Allison's children. I could have asked Allison how she could sit there while her kids opened boxes labeled with her niece's name. I could have told my father exactly what I thought of a man who watched an 11-year-old humiliated and worried only about whether I might spoil the holiday. Instead, I said, "Sophie doesn't need to stand here for this." Then we left. The drive home was quieter than the drive there. I did not interrogate Sophie about how she felt, because I could see she was working too hard to keep herself together. Halfway home, I told her she had done nothing wrong, and she nodded without looking away from the window. When we reached the house, I made hot chocolate, found the thick socks she liked, and told her she could talk to me whenever she wanted, or not talk at all that night. She changed into pajamas and went upstairs with her mug. Only after her bedroom door closed did I open my work laptop. Clark Commercial Supply's fiscal year had ended on November 30th. Our finance team had nearly finished the annual lender compliance package, and we planned to send it on December 29th, well ahead of the January 15th deadline. Most of it was routine. I had reviewed the numbers before Christmas, but one summary had bothered me enough that I had left a note to revisit it. Related. Party transactions connected to Allison's department. I had not accused anyone of anything. At that point, I did not have evidence of wrongdoing. I had a handful of expenses that looked ordinary individually and slightly less ordinary when placed beside one another. Normally, I would have reconciled them after Christmas and moved on. That night, however, I was done signing my name under things I had not finished verifying just because my father expected cooperation. I opened the certification workflow and changed my status to unable to certify pending reconciliation of related party transactions. That did not freeze the company. It did not contact the bank. It did not launch an investigation. It simply meant the package scheduled for December 29th could not be submitted with my certification until the supporting schedule was reconciled. The internal system immediately alerted James because he was the chief executive officer. My phone rang less than 2 minutes later. I watched his name disappear from the screen. Then he called again. And again. By the 6th call, Sophie was asleep upstairs and the house had gone completely quiet. That was when he left the voicemail asking me to undo it. I did not call him back. Instead, I reopened the expense summary that had bothered me before Christmas and sorted Allison's department transactions from highest to lowest. 5 consecutive invoices sat just below the amount that would have triggered an additional level of review. Not wildly below it. Not randomly below it. Each one missed the threshold by a margin small enough to make me sit straighter in my chair. For the first time that night, I stopped thinking about the presents and started wondering what my family had been so afraid I might look at. The morning after Christmas, I woke to 2 messages that told me exactly how my parents intended to frame what had happened. My mother's came first. Susan wrote that she was devastated I had overreacted in front of the children and hoped I would apologize before the situation became something the family could not repair. My father's message arrived 6 minutes later and sounded less like a parent than a chief executive addressing an employee. Whatever happened yesterday was personal. You need to separate family from work. I read that sentence twice because it was language I recognized. For years, I had been the one saying almost the same thing. Whenever James interfered with a decision because Allison wanted something, whenever Susan brought some private grievance into the office, I told myself I could separate family from work if I stayed disciplined enough. Seeing my father use that logic against me made me realize how convenient that separation had always been for everyone except me. Sophie came downstairs late that morning wearing the same oversized sweatshirt she usually wore on weekends. I made pancakes because routine seemed kinder than interrogation. And for the first 10 minutes, we talked about nothing more serious than whether the blueberries had gone bad. Then she pushed a piece of pancake around her plate and asked if Grandma was mad at me. I told her Grandma's feelings were Grandma's responsibility, not hers. Sophie nodded, but she did not look convinced. I finally said, "I never thought they would do something like that to you." She looked up at me with an expression that made my stomach tighten. "I did," she said. I asked what she meant, and Sophie gave me the kind of answer only a child gives when adults have spent years pretending small things do not add up. She reminded me that Grandma always took pictures of Allison's kids first at birthdays and family dinners, then called Sophie over if there was still room. Grandpa could tell you which cousin had soccer practice on Tuesday, and which one had a basketball tournament Saturday, but he had forgotten Sophie's winter recital after promising twice that he would come. The previous Christmas, my mother had given Sophie a generic department store gift card, while Allison's children opened the exact items they had put on their wish lists. None of those things had seemed large enough for me to declare war over. That was how favoritism had survived so comfortably. It rarely arrived as one enormous offense. It arrived as 100 moments that each came with a plausible explanation. I did not tell Sophie she should have said something sooner. That would have been cowardly, because she had said things in the way children often do. She had stopped asking whether Grandpa was coming to her events. She had lingered near me instead of running into my parents' house ahead of me. She had once asked why Grandma knew the cousins' favorite snacks, but kept buying her peanut butter crackers when she did not even like them. I had answered those moments with explanations, because explanations were easier than admitting the pattern. Sitting across from her that morning, I told her I should have paid more attention. Sophie shrugged and said she had thought I already knew. That hurt, but it was useful pain. I did not need to drown in guilt. I needed to stop asking my daughter to live inside a compromise that had made sense only to me. The truth was that I had never been the daughter who let my parents run my life. I did not take money from them after my divorce. Susan did not have a key to my house. When she pushed for Sophie to attend the private school Allison's children attended, I chose the school I thought was better for my daughter and refused to debate it for 3 months. I skipped family dinners when I wanted to. I spent holidays elsewhere when the atmosphere became unbearable. Those boundaries were exactly why my parents called me difficult. My mistake was not that I had no boundaries. My mistake was believing I could build enough of them to make a healthy relationship possible for Sophie without confronting what was happening inside the space that remained. By Monday morning, I had shifted back into the part of my life where emotions were supposed to have documentation behind them. Clark Commercial Supplies offices reopened on December 29th. And at 8:15 I sent a routine request to our accounting team for the transaction details supporting the related party schedule. I did not mention Allison. I did not mention Christmas. I did not use words like fraud, abuse, or investigation. Our lender compliance package required my certification, and I could not certify a schedule I had not reconciled. That was enough. I copied our outside accountant because the certification was already pending, then asked the team to preserve the supporting invoices, vendor coding, approval history, and any reimbursement records attached to the entries. James called me before 10. His voice was controlled, which with my father usually meant he was angrier than when he shouted, "You're delaying the bank package because you're mad at your sister." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the request I had actually sent. I asked accounting to reconcile related party transactions. He said, "Don't play games with me, Marissa." I asked him a simple question. "Why did you assume I meant Allison?" There was a short silence. Then he told me everyone knew I was angry after Christmas, and that I needed to act like a chief financial officer instead of a wounded mother. It was not proof of anything. I knew that. A suspicious reaction was not evidence, and I had spent too many years working with numbers to confuse the two. But I wrote down the time of the conversation and exactly what he had said. Later that afternoon, our outside accountant confirmed that the package should not go to the lender with an unresolved related party schedule. That did not trigger some financial apocalypse. Nobody froze our accounts. Nobody threatened to seize the company. James and our two independent directors agreed that the lender needed to be told the certification was being delayed while the schedule was reconciled. The following day, the lender gave us a written extension until March 2nd. That bought us time without pretending nothing was wrong. And it also removed one of my father's favorite weapons: manufactured urgency. He could no longer tell me I had to sign that afternoon or destroy the company. Allison texted me that evening. "You got what you wanted. Mom's crying." I stared at the screen long enough to feel the old instinct rise in me, the one that wanted to explain myself until everyone admitted I was reasonable. I ignored it. Instead, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since I saw my mother's phone pointed at the tree. "Did you know Mom was going to take Sophie's gifts?" Allison did not answer for 11 minutes. Then she wrote, "Why does it matter now?" I replied, "Because I asked you a direct question." Another pause followed. Finally, 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before her answer came through. "Mom told me not to interfere. I thought she was just trying to make a point." I read the message several times. It was not yet the whole truth, but it changed the shape of Christmas. Allison had known enough to stay silent. My mother had expected interference and had prevented it in advance. That meant what happened under the tree had not simply escalated in the moment. At least part of it had been planned. I took screenshots, exported the message thread through the normal backup function on my phone, and stored a copy with my personal records. Then I closed it. I was not ready to confront Allison again, and I did not need to. For the first time in years, I understood that getting an answer was more useful than winning the argument that followed it. The accounting export arrived the next morning. I expected to see the 5 transactions that had caught my attention on Christmas night. Instead, the spreadsheet ran for pages. The same vendor names appeared across multiple quarters. So did the same expense categories. I sorted the entries by amount, then by approver, then by date. A pattern began to form that was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Again and again, invoices connected to Allison's department landed just beneath the threshold that would have required another level of review, not once or twice, repeatedly, across months. I sat there looking at the screen while the office around me slowly came to life. Phones rang. Someone laughed near the break room. A printer started somewhere down the hall. On my monitor, the numbers stayed perfectly quiet. That was one reason I had always trusted them more than people. They did not need me to believe them. They only needed me to pay attention. And now that I was paying attention, I could see that whatever my family had been hiding had started long before Christmas. The first Monday after New Year's, my father asked me to come into the main conference room at 10. The calendar invitation said succession planning, which surprised me because James had spent the previous week insisting the only urgent issue was the lender package I was supposedly holding hostage. When I walked in, Allison was already seated beside him. My mother sat at the far end of the table with a leather folder in front of her, and the succession advisor James had been using for months was connecting his laptop to the screen. Susan was there as a shareholder, not a director. Our board had 5 seats. James, Allison, me, and 2 independent directors we had added 2 years earlier when our lender pushed for stronger governance. That distinction had never mattered much to Susan. She had spent most of my life behaving as though a family relationship was simply another form of voting authority. James waited until I sat down before saying, "We need to stop letting temporary problems derail long-term planning." The screen behind him filled with a title I had heard before but had never seen in final form: The Clark Family Continuity Plan. My father began with words he loved because they sounded impossible to disagree with: stability, legacy, stewardship, keeping the company in the family. He talked about the business he had started nearly 30 years earlier, about how quickly outside investors could strip the character out of a family-owned company, and about his responsibility to make sure Clark Commercial Supply remained Clark Commercial Supply after he was gone. None of that sounded unreasonable. That was what made my father effective when he wanted something. He rarely started with the part that benefited him. I let him talk until the advisor opened the proposed voting structure. Then I asked, "Who appoints the future voting trustees?" James looked at me as though I had interrupted a toast to ask about plumbing. The advisor answered that the initial trustees would be selected by the current controlling family shareholders. I asked who could remove them. He explained the process. I asked what percentage of shareholder approval was required to amend the voting provisions. That was when James leaned back in his chair and said, "Marissa, this is exactly what I mean. You turn everything into a technical argument." I looked at the advisor instead. "What percentage?" 80%, he said. I already knew the number from our shareholder agreement, but I wanted it stated in the room. My parents together owned 50% of the company. Allison owned 25. I owned 25. If James, Susan, and Allison all voted together, they had 75%. That was a powerful block, but it was not enough to make the structural changes in front of me. They needed at least part of my vote, and under the way the proposal was drafted, they needed my consent to the amendment package. Suddenly, several things my father had done over the previous months made more sense. He could call me difficult. He could threaten my position as CFO. He could tell relatives I had become too corporate. But he could not simply remove me from the ownership structure and proceed as though my shares belonged to him. James seemed to read the realization on my face. "Nobody is trying to take anything from you," he said. I had not accused him of that. He continued anyway, explaining that my economic interest would remain protected and that the new structure was about preserving family participation across generations. I asked the advisor to open the next generation schedule. He clicked to a page listing the people expected to become future beneficiaries of voting participation under the proposed structure. There were 3 names under the heading for the next generation. All 3 belonged to Allison's children. Sophie's name was nowhere on the page. I did not react immediately. I read the paragraph above the schedule instead. It described the next generation actively participating in the Clark family enterprise. The language was polished enough to hide what the list beneath it made obvious. I put my finger on the page in front of me. What qualifies someone as actively participating? The advisor said the term had not been fully defined yet, and that the schedule was illustrative rather than final. James answered before I could ask anything else. "It reflects reality. Allison's children are here. They're part of this family's life. Sophie barely knows the business. She's 11, I said. That's not what I mean." I knew exactly what he meant, because I had heard a cruder version of it on Christmas morning. Susan had called Allison's children the real grandkids. James had just found a cleaner vocabulary for the same hierarchy. The children who stayed physically close to my parents were family. The daughter who set boundaries had chosen distance. Therefore, her child could be treated as if she had chosen distance too. James folded his hands on the table. "You've always wanted independence, Marissa. We respected that. You moved farther away. You keep Sophie out of family activities when you're upset. You made it clear you didn't want your life managed by us. You can't demand distance and then act offended when the people who actually participate are treated differently." There were at least 6 things wrong with that sentence, but I had finally learned that answering every accusation was one of the easiest ways to lose control of a conversation. I did not explain why I lived 35 minutes away. I did not list every birthday Sophie had attended or every event my parents had skipped. I did not argue about Christmas. I looked at the plan again and asked the only question that mattered. "Are you asking for my consent to this structure now?" James's jaw tightened. "We need to move forward." That wasn't my question. The advisor glanced between us before answering. "Yes." The proposed amendments required shareholder consent, and they wanted to finalize the structure during the first quarter. I closed the folder. "Then my answer is no. I'm not consenting to structural changes while the related party reconciliation is unresolved and while the lender package still requires my certification." Susan immediately said I was punishing everyone because of Christmas. Allison stared at the table. James told me I was jeopardizing years of planning over bookkeeping questions that could be cleaned up in a week. I kept my voice level. "If they can be cleaned up in a week, then we can revisit this after they're cleaned up." That was the first time James raised his voice. "You don't get to hold the future of this company hostage every time you decide you need another review. the succession advisor stopped typing. Susan looked at me with the familiar expression she wore when she believed my refusal was proof of a defect in my character rather than an answer she disliked. I reminded James that the agreement required my consent because those were the ownership rights he and his lawyers had put in place years earlier. If he regretted giving me those rights, that did not make them disappear. The meeting ended without a vote. James left first. Susan followed him after telling Allison they would talk later, which was her way of reminding everyone that the real meeting would happen somewhere I was not invited. I stayed behind long enough to make sure the advisor uploaded the current draft to the shared deal room. As a director, shareholder, and CFO, I already had legitimate access to the repository. I was not searching anyone's private email or opening files I had no right to see. I wanted to understand how the document had changed and when. That afternoon, I opened the version history from my office. Most of the edits were boring: definitions, trustee language, tax notes, formatting. Then I reached a version saved 11 days before Christmas. One comment from James sat beside the voting section: "Need Marissa's consent before we lock the structure." That did not surprise me anymore. A second comment did: "Do not circulate final voting schedule until after the holiday meeting." I sat back and checked the timestamp twice. The comment had been entered before Susan asked me to bring Sophie to Christmas and before my mother moved a single gift under that tree. It did not prove James knew Susan intended to humiliate my daughter. It did not prove the phone on the shelf had anything to do with the continuity plan. I was careful not to turn suspicion into fact simply because I was angry, but it proved the timing mattered. Someone had deliberately decided that I should not see the final voting structure until after Christmas. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether what happened under my parents' tree had been designed to do more than hurt me. By January 8th, the transaction list had stopped looking like a handful of odd expenses and started looking like something more dangerous, a system working exactly the way it had been taught to work. I knew that system better than anyone because I had built part of it. 3 years earlier, when Clark Commercial Supply was growing faster than our accounting process could handle, I had changed the approval structure, so I would not have to review every minor invoice personally. Expenses below a certain threshold could move through department approval unless they hit another risk category. James had hated the change at first. He called it too corporate and complained that I was turning a family business into a bank. I had defended it because it was efficient, scalable, and completely reasonable if the people using it acted in good faith. Looking at Allison's department records, I realized good faith had been the assumption I never wrote down. The accounting team had already started matching vendor names, dates, descriptions, and supporting documents. One vendor in particular kept appearing in the outreach budget. They were a legitimate event company. They had handled booths, catering, transportation, and promotional work for several real community events, so there was nothing suspicious about seeing their name in our system. The problem was what happened when I stopped looking at the vendor and started looking at the individual invoices. Several charges appeared within days of each other, each one coded differently, each one landing just under the level that would have triggered an extra layer of review. I asked our accounting manager, Denise, to sit down with me and walk through the records without giving me theories. I wanted facts first. She showed me an invoice for a community partnership dinner that made sense, then another for transportation during the same week that contained vague language about regional guest movement. A third was labeled hospitality support. The amounts were not enormous, and each document contained enough business language to avoid looking absurd on its own. That was exactly why I had missed the pattern before. Nobody reviewing one invoice at a time would have seen the same thing I was seeing when they were lined up across 2 screens. I asked Denise, who normally approved Allison's exceptions. She hesitated before answering, which bothered me more than the answer itself. Finally, she said, "Usually, Allison, sometimes James tells us something is fine." I asked whether James put those approvals in writing. Denise shook her head and added that Susan sometimes called accounting too, especially when an expense involved a family event that had some company connection. Susan was not an employee and had no formal approval authority, so I asked why anyone treated her calls as meaningful. Denise looked uncomfortable and said, "Because when we pushed back, it usually came back through Mr. Clark anyway." That was when I saw the real weakness. Nobody had sat in a room and designed a conspiracy. Nobody had written a memo saying Allison did not have to follow the rules. The staff had simply learned, one uncomfortable interaction at a time, that questioning Allison created trouble, and approving her created none. Eventually, family approved had become an unofficial category that did not exist anywhere in our policy manual. My system had not been broken. It had been surrounded by a culture that taught people when not to use it. I should have stopped there and widened the review properly. I did not. That was my mistake. I had spent days looking at Christmas, Sophie, the continuity plan, and now a transaction pattern that seemed to reward the same branch of the family over and over. When Denise showed me that Allison's corporate card was still active and several new expenses were pending, I made a decision I had the authority to make, but had not thought through carefully enough. I temporarily suspended the card and expense privileges for Allison's department while we reconciled the open items. The email I sent was short and professional. It referenced pending review, preservation of records, and temporary suspension of discretionary spending. I did not mention Christmas. I did not accuse Allison of fraud. I told myself those facts were enough to keep the action clean. What I failed to account for was how the timing looked to anyone who did not have my entire thought process sitting in front of them. James understood that before I did. Less than an hour later, all 5 directors received an email from him. He wrote that he was deeply concerned that the company's chief financial officer had taken punitive action against her own sister immediately after a private family dispute. He said he supported appropriate financial controls but warned that executive authority could not be used to settle personal grievances. He never claimed I had broken a law or automatically lost my position. He did something more useful to him. He took a decision that had a legitimate business basis and wrapped it in a story everyone already knew. One of our independent directors, Helen Porter, called me that afternoon. She did not accuse me of retaliation, and that almost made the conversation harder. She asked why the suspension had been necessary before the scope of any formal related party review had been established. I explained that new discretionary expenses were still moving through the department. She asked whether there had been evidence those specific pending expenses were improper. I said no. Then she asked whether a less unilateral control could have achieved the same objective. I knew the answer before she finished the question. Yes. That realization irritated me because James was using Christmas as a shield. But irritation did not change the fact that I had given him something useful. I had acted inside my authority. Yet I had also acted while angry and before creating enough procedural distance between myself and Allison. If I spent the next week defending the suspensions simply because reversing it would feel like giving my father a victory, then pride would turn one tactical mistake into a much larger one. I had spent years telling people that good controls were supposed to survive scrutiny. Mine needed to survive scrutiny too. The next morning, I sent a revised proposal to both independent directors and our outside accountant. I rescinded the blanket suspension on Allison's department. In its place, I proposed that every related party expense and every discretionary charge connected to immediate family members receive dual review until the reconciliation was complete. One approval would come from our outside accountant. The other would come from an independent director. I specifically removed myself from sole discretionary authority over those items. James called that surrender. Allison called it humiliating. I considered it neither. If the expenses were legitimate, an independent process would clear them. If they were not, nobody could credibly claim I had manufactured the outcome because I was angry about Christmas. Helen approved the temporary process, and the second independent director agreed. By the end of the day, the new review structure was in place. That did not make me feel better about how I had handled the previous 48 hours. I had been so focused on proving that I was not weak that I nearly made strength look like impulsiveness. For years, James had counted on me to defend every decision once I made it, because he knew how much I hated admitting I had misjudged something. This time, I gave him the opposite. I corrected the decision before he could turn my ego into part of his case. 2 days later, our outside accountant called with the first result from the expanded review. The event vendor I had been studying had invoiced Clark Commercial Supply for a legitimate outreach event during one particular week. That part checked out. But buried among the supporting records was a transportation charge from the same vendor tied to travel dates that extended beyond the business event, and the passenger information included members of Allison's family. I asked the accountant whether that proved the company had paid for a family vacation. He said no. The expense still needed to be allocated and supported, and there could be a legitimate business explanation for part of it. I thanked him for not jumping ahead, because by then I had learned how dangerous it was to want the conclusion before the evidence was ready. After the call, I pulled up the rest of that week's transactions. The event itself was real. The business purpose was real. But so was the family travel sitting beside it. And for the first time, I could see exactly how something personal could disappear inside something legitimate. By the middle of January, I had stopped thinking of Christmas as a single ugly morning. Too many pieces had started connecting around it. My mother had asked for Sophie's wish list 2 weeks before the holiday. She had sent pictures to the family group chat while she was shopping, including one of the watercolor sets Sophie wanted. The phone had been positioned before Sophie and I arrived. My father had told me to calm down before I had raised my voice, and Allison had admitted that Susan had told her not to interfere. None of those things, by themselves, proved what I suspected. Put together, they told me Christmas deserved to be reconstructed the same way I would reconstruct a questionable transaction, in order, with assumptions separated from facts. I made a simple timeline on a legal pad at my desk. December 11th, Susan asked for Sophie's list. December 14th, she sent a picture of several purchases and joked that she was almost done shopping. December 23rd, Allison confirmed the family would all be at my parents' house Christmas morning. December 25th, the gifts carrying Sophie's name were moved one by one to Allison's children while a phone pointed at the room. Then came my parents' strangely premature warnings about my behavior. The timeline could not tell me what Susan intended, but it showed preparation where she later claimed there had only been a spontaneous disagreement. I called Allison that evening and asked her again what our mother had told her before Christmas. She immediately sounded tired. We already talked about this. I reminded her that she had told me Susan said not to interfere, but she had never explained what that meant. Allison said Mom had been frustrated because I always made everything about fairness and had wanted to make a point about children who actually showed up for the family. Hearing her repeat that language made me angry, but I kept my voice even. If that's really all you understood, send me what she wrote. There was a long pause. Allison asked why I needed her private messages. I told her I was not asking for every conversation she had ever had with Mom. I was asking for the thread she was using to defend herself. She said I was trying to drag Christmas into the company review. I told her I was trying to understand whether Christmas had been planned before I reacted to anything at work. You keep saying you didn't know what she was going to do, I said. Then show me what you did know. She did not send anything that night. The next afternoon, 3 forwarded screenshots arrived on my personal phone with a message from Allison that said, "This is what she sent me." I swear I thought she was just being dramatic. I opened the first screenshot and saw my mother's name at the top. Susan had written 2 days before Christmas. "Don't interfere when I move Sophie's presents. Marissa will do the rest herself." Allison had replied with a question mark. Susan answered, "If she grabs anything from the kids, everyone will finally see it." A later message told Allison to keep her children near the tree and not argue with me if I became upset. For several seconds, I could hear my own pulse more clearly than anything in the room. I had spent weeks making sure I did not exaggerate what happened because anger makes people careless with facts. Now I was looking at my mother describing, before Christmas morning, exactly the situation she intended to create. She knew Sophie would watch her gifts being handed away. She expected me to intervene physically. She wanted a reaction strong enough that other people could later be shown what kind of person I supposedly was. The part that turned my stomach was not that she had tried to manipulate me. Susan had been trying to manage my reactions since I was a teenager. It was that she had chosen my 11-year-old daughter as the bait. I saved the screenshots and backed them up, but I did not pretend they were courtroom evidence simply because I believed them. Allison had forwarded screenshots from her own phone. If those messages ever mattered in a formal company proceeding, Allison would need to confirm they were authentic and that the thread had not been altered. I wrote down when I received them and left the originals untouched on my phone. I had learned enough in the previous 2 weeks to stop confusing a powerful clue with a finished case. The messages also forced me to be careful about James. Nothing Allison sent showed my father designing the Christmas trap with Susan. There was no text from him saying to move the presents, set up the phone, or provoke me. What I did know was what I had personally watched him do. He had told me to calm down before I became angry. He had accused me of ruining Christmas while Sophie was the one standing there humiliated. Then, after I questioned related party transactions, he had immediately told the board my actions were retaliation caused by a private family dispute. I could not honestly say he had planned every step with Susan. I could say he had been ready to use the story she created. That distinction mattered to me because I was beginning to understand what revenge could do to judgment if I let it. It would have been emotionally satisfying to decide that every member of my family had sat around a table conspiring against me. The evidence did not support that. Susan had designed the emotional trap. Allison had known enough to stay out of the way. James had supported the narrative afterward and had his own reason to want me portrayed as unstable. Those facts were already bad enough. I did not need to improve them. That night, I sat on the edge of Sophie's bed while she finished a drawing for school. I did not show her the messages. There was nothing in them an 11-year-old needed to carry. I told her I had learned that Grandma had planned part of what happened on Christmas, and that it was not because Sophie had done anything wrong. She kept shading one corner of the paper before asking, "Do I have to go back if she says sorry?" I told her no. Then she asked the harder question. Do I have to forgive her if she says sorry? I thought about all the years adults had used forgiveness as a shortcut around accountability. No, I said. You don't owe anyone forgiveness on their schedule. If you ever forgive them, it should be because you want to, not because they want the consequences to stop. Sophie nodded and went back to her drawing. I stayed beside her for another minute, feeling something settle inside me. I was no longer trying to preserve a relationship with my parents for her sake. I was going to let Sophie decide what relationship, if any, felt safe to her. 2 days later, the financial side moved forward on its own merits. Our outside accountant finished an initial review of the control exceptions and asked for a meeting with both independent directors. The conclusion was careful. There was not enough information to label every disputed expense improper, but there were enough recurring related party exceptions, inconsistent documentation, verbal approvals, and mixed personal and business charges to justify a formal review. I did not chair the decision. I presented the records I had, answered questions about our policies, and stepped back when Helen asked the outside accountant for his recommendation. Both independent directors voted to expand the review. The scope would include related party expenses over a defined look-back period, approval practices involving immediate family members, vendor documentation, reimbursement records, and company communications tied to those transactions. They also issued a preservation instruction for relevant company records, so invoices, approvals, emails, and accounting files would not be deleted under ordinary retention practices while the review was active. Nothing dramatic happened when the decision was made. No one was arrested. No accounts were frozen. The company kept operating. But the balance of power changed in that conference room. Until then, James could still describe everything as a family misunderstanding that his difficult eldest daughter had dragged into work. Now, 2 directors with no stake in our Christmas argument and an outside accountant had looked at the records and decided the questions were real enough to examine formally. My father could still complain about me. He could still fight the findings. What he could no longer do was make the problem disappear by declaring that family business stayed inside the family. And once the review moved outside his control, I knew we were finally going to find out how far that phrase had allowed him to go. By January 21st, the review had become structured enough that I could no longer look at a questionable expense and decide what I thought it meant. That was exactly what I wanted. Our outside accountant and the 2 independent directors agreed on a defined look-back period and divided the transactions into categories. Legitimate business expenses stayed legitimate. Mixed-purpose expenses had to be separated between company use and personal use. Unsupported personal benefits needed documentation or correction. Control exceptions were reviewed to determine why normal approval rules had been bypassed. I supplied records, answered questions about policy, and then stepped back. After the mistake I had made when I suspended Allison's expense privileges too quickly, I wanted every important conclusion to survive without depending on my anger, my judgment, or my relationship to the people involved. The distinction mattered almost immediately. The transportation expense I had noticed earlier was not completely improper. Part of the trip involved a real community event that Allison had attended on behalf of the company. The business portion was legitimate. The problem was that several family members remained after the event ended, and the company had been billed for costs extending into the personal portion of the trip. Another expense connected to a school sponsorship also turned out to be more complicated than I expected. Clark Commercial Supply genuinely sponsored a local education program, but additional charges had been bundled into the event account without clear documentation showing what business purpose they served. I could have called all of it fraud and made myself feel vindicated. The accountant called it what the records supported. Some charges were valid, some required allocation, some were unsupported. That restraint made the findings more credible than anything I could have said about my family. Allison was asked to explain several of the expenses because they carried her department code or her approval. She came into the conference room already angry and treated the questions as accusations. She said Dad had approved the travel. She said Susan had coordinated parts of the school event. She said accounting had always handled things that way, and nobody had complained before. I asked whether she had written approval from James for the personal extensions. She said most of their conversations happened verbally. I asked whether she had messages about the other exceptions. She found a few informal texts, but nothing that covered every charge. I did not ask why she thought any of it was fair. Fairness was not the standard in that room. Documentation was. That seemed to frustrate her more than if I had attacked her. Allison was used to arguments where she could say I was jealous or judgmental, and Susan could step in to translate everything into family loyalty. The accountant did not care which sister had been favored at Christmas. He wanted to know who approved an expense, what policy allowed it, and whether the company received a legitimate benefit. When Allison said, "Dad told me it was fine," he simply asked whether that approval had been recorded anywhere. Watching her search through emails and messages, I began to understand something I had missed for years. My sister had enjoyed the freedom of being the exception, but exceptions rarely protect the person benefiting from them once someone finally asks for a paper trail. Susan changed tactics before James did. One evening, she sent me a picture of our parents' dining room table, covered with wrapped gifts. Every box she had taken from Sophie on Christmas was there, along with several new packages I had never seen. Her message said, "We have everything waiting for her. I want to make this right." A few minutes later, she sent another picture, showing an expensive art set and a new tablet. There was no acknowledgement of what she had said under the tree, no mention of the messages she had sent Allison before Christmas. Just more expensive objects placed where an apology should have been. I showed Sophie neither picture. The gifts were not hers again, simply because Susan had decided they were available. I replied that if Mom wanted to discuss an apology someday, we could discuss an apology. I was not discussing Sophie's relationship with them while the company issues were unresolved. Susan answered that I was proving her point by mixing business with family. I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. My parents were allowed to use company money, company influence, family loyalty, and access to my daughter as parts of the same system. The moment I insisted those things be separated, I was accused of mixing them together. James called the next morning and asked me to meet him in his office. For the first time since Christmas, he did not begin with anger. He said everyone was exhausted. He said the lender had given us until March 2nd, and there was no reason to keep creating uncertainty when we all knew most of the disputed expenses would probably turn out to have reasonable explanations. Then he slid a short proposal across his desk. He and Susan would return all of Sophie's gifts, add money to a college account for her, and revise some of the language in the continuity plan so I would feel more comfortable about the next generation provisions. I read the page twice before asking what he wanted from me. James said he wanted the lender package certified as soon as possible and wanted the review scope to remain focused on the transactions already identified. After that, he wanted me to stop blocking the continuity plan over what he called language problems we can fix. I put the paper back on his desk. I'll sign the lender certification when the related party schedule is reconciled and I can truthfully certify it. We both know the company is fine. That isn't what the certification says. He leaned back. So this is still about Christmas? No, that's why I'm not trading a college account for Sophie for my signature. His expression hardened. Nobody said trade. Then the college account doesn't need to be in this conversation. James told me I was making simple things complicated. I told him the lender had already given us time. There was no business reason for me to sign early while the review was still active. If he wanted to make something right with Sophie, he could do that without asking me to narrow a financial review or support a shareholder amendment in return. He ended the meeting by saying I would regret turning every disagreement into a governance issue. I left without arguing about whether that was what I had done. Later that afternoon, he sent a follow-up email summarizing his proposed path to resolution. The language was much cleaner than what he had said aloud, but it still linked the return of Sophie's gifts, the proposed college account, lender certification, and continued discussion of the continuity plan in the same sequence. I saved the email with the rest of the meeting materials. I did not call it bribery. I did not need a dramatic label. The document already showed exactly what he believed could be negotiated together. A few days later, I reviewed the working papers from the financial reconciliation and noticed something that bothered me for a different reason. James had created much of the culture that allowed the exceptions. Susan had pushed accounting staff informally. But the visible records did not say James's daughter was favored because James wanted it that way. They showed Allison's department codes, Allison's card, Allison's approvals, and Allison as the person receiving many of the benefits. When the system had been working in her favor, her name on everything had been an advantage. Under review, the same paper trail made her the easiest person to point at. For the first time, I saw the arrangement from Allison's side without excusing what she had done. Our parents had rewarded her for staying close, for saying yes, and for accepting their help. But they had also allowed her to stand where the records would land first, if anyone ever started asking questions. James could say he had only given verbal permission. Susan had no formal approval authority at all. Allison was the one whose name appeared again and again. That realization sent me back to the continuity plan. I opened the official annex in the corporate deal room and read the voting provisions more carefully than I had before. The plan gave Allison's branch obvious economic advantages and made her children look like the center of the company's future. But several pages later, buried inside the supervisory provisions, I found the part James had never emphasized. For years, after the proposed restructuring, certain major voting decisions would still require approval from a control layer held by my parents. Allison was being offered the future, but James and Susan intended to keep the steering wheel. The first thing I did on Monday morning was send Allison a page number. No accusation, no explanation, just the annex from the official continuity plan and one question beneath it. Do you actually control those votes? She called me less than 5 minutes later. Her voice was already defensive. What are you doing, Marissa? I told her I was doing nothing. The document was in the same deal room available to every shareholder involved in the proposal. I had simply read it. Allison accused me of trying to turn her against Mom and Dad because the financial review had not produced the disaster I apparently wanted. I let her finish, then asked her again whether she had read the supervisory voting provisions herself. This time, there was a longer silence. Finally, she said, Dad explained it to me. That wasn't my question, I said. I heard paper moving on her end, followed by the tapping of a keyboard. The section I had pointed her toward was written in the kind of language people tend to skim because every sentence feels designed to make your eyes slide off the page. The proposed structure would eventually place certain future economic interests with Allison's branch of the family, including benefits intended for her children. That was the part James had emphasized whenever he talked about protecting the next generation. What he had emphasized much less was the control layer sitting above those interests. As long as my parents held the designated supervisory rights, several major decisions involving the voting structure would still require their approval. Allison could benefit from the arrangement without being free to direct it the way she had assumed. She read for several minutes while I stayed quiet. Then she said, "That's temporary." I told her it could last for years. Under the current draft, she said Dad would never interfere unless something serious happened. I asked her why the mechanism existed if nobody intended to use it. That irritated her. Because someone has to protect the company from people who walk away whenever they don't get what they want. I knew exactly who she meant. For once, I did not take the bait. "I'm not asking whether Dad trusts me," I said. "I'm asking whether the plan you've been defending actually gives you the control you think it does." She did not answer. What I heard instead was the sound of someone discovering that a gift had conditions printed in smaller type. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. Allison arrived 10 minutes late and dropped into the chair across from me without taking off her coat. She said I had always been good at making independence look noble because I had never stayed around long enough to deal with the family work. I asked what she meant by family work. She started listing dinners, birthdays, doctor appointments for our parents, school pickups, holiday planning, and all the ordinary things she had handled because she lived closer. She was right about some of it. There had been times when Allison carried responsibilities I did not, and I told her so. That seemed to surprise her more than an argument would have. Then I told her there was another side she kept leaving out. Mom and Dad had helped with her mortgage when she moved closer. The company paid her a salary generous for a role with loosely defined responsibilities. Susan watched the children whenever Allison needed her. James paid for things that somehow always arrived, labeled as family support instead of control. "You stayed close," I said. "And they rewarded staying close." Allison's expression hardened. "So now I'm bought?" I shook my head. "I think you made choices that worked for you. I also think Mom and Dad taught both of us. There was a price for every kind of choice. I paid for independence by being called selfish. You got rewarded for obedience. I'm asking whether you ever noticed the reward came with a leash." She pushed her coffee away without drinking it. "You left me to deal with them." That accusation landed because there was truth inside it. I had spent years congratulating myself for building boundaries while Allison absorbed more of our parents' daily expectations. But the fact that I had stepped away did not erase the privileges she had accepted. And her resentment did not erase what she had done on Christmas. I told her that plainly. "You knew Mom was going to use Sophie's gifts to make a point, and you let your kids open them." Allison looked down. I know. It was the first time she had said those words without adding an excuse. I did not forgive her on the spot. I did not need to. The conversation had finally moved beyond which daughter our parents loved more. We were talking about the bargain each of us had made to survive them. Later that week, Allison called me again, but this time she sounded shaken rather than angry. Susan had called her after learning the independent directors were moving forward with the review. Allison told me our mother had started with tears, then moved into reminders. "After everything we've done for you," Susan had said. She reminded Allison about the house, childcare, company position, vacations, and every emergency James had ever helped solve. Then she told her that the upcoming special meeting would determine whether the family remained united or whether I succeeded in tearing it apart. The message underneath was not subtle. Continued support belonged to the daughter who stood with them. Allison said, she kept saying I needed to remember who had always been there for me. I asked what she had told our mother. "Nothing useful," she said. I said I had to go. I did not ask Allison to send me the conversation. A phone call she described to me was not something I could turn into evidence simply because it fit my theory. A few days later, however, independent counsel contacted her directly because the review had reached transactions approved under her department code. Allison received a formal request for invoices, messages, reimbursements, and explanations for several mixed-purpose expenses. That changed her attitude faster than anything I had said. Until then, she had treated the review as something happening around her. Now her name was on the request. She came to my office with the letter folded in half. "Dad approved most of these," she said. I told her to provide whatever documentation she had showing that. She said many approvals had been verbal. He told accounting it was fine. I asked whether she had emails. She had a few informal messages, but not enough to cover everything. That was when the reality of being the visible beneficiary finally reached her. James had encouraged the exceptions, but Allison's department codes, card records, and approvals were the things sitting in the accounting system. My parents had enjoyed the power to make exceptions. Allison had enjoyed the benefits. Now the records showed her name much more clearly than theirs. She called James from the hallway while I stayed in my office. I could not hear his side, but when she returned, her face had changed. He said to just tell them what happened. I asked what was wrong with that advice. Allison stared at me. He said it like none of it had anything to do with him. There was nothing I could say that would make that realization kinder. For years, being the chosen daughter had meant James stepping in before consequences reached her. Now that the consequences had a paper trail, he was suddenly very interested in everyone being responsible for their own actions. Allison sat across from my desk and asked, "What am I supposed to say to counsel?" It would have been easy to use that moment. I could have told her exactly how to frame James, which messages to emphasize, which expenses to blame on our parents. I could have made her dependent on me at the exact moment she was beginning to question them. That would have been the same game with a different person holding the strings. Tell them exactly what you knew, what you signed, what Dad told you, and what you didn't know, I said. Don't guess. Don't protect anyone. Don't exaggerate anything. She asked whether I thought she needed her own attorney. I told her that was her decision, and that I could not advise her personally while I was involved in the company review. For the first time in our adult lives, Allison looked at me without expecting me either to fight her or rescue her. I did neither. She had benefited from our parents' system, and she was going to have to answer for the choices she had made inside it. But she was also beginning to see something I had only recently understood myself. James had not chosen her, because he trusted her with more freedom than he trusted me. He had chosen her because she had spent years accepting arrangements in which support and obedience were almost impossible to separate. On February 10th, a formal notice arrived for all shareholders, directors, and senior leadership. James was calling a special meeting for early March. The stated purposes were to address the continuity plan, review management concerns, and, in his words, restore confidence in the company's leadership. I read the notice twice and forwarded it to my counsel and the independent directors. My father still believed he could bring everyone into one room, define what had happened, and make the family line up behind him again. What he did not know was that Allison had finally started reading the fine print. The boxes arrived on a cold Monday afternoon in the middle of February. I knew they were from my mother before I opened the front door because I recognized the silver paper through the glass. Susan had sent back every present she had taken from Sophie on Christmas morning, still wrapped exactly as they had been that day. There were new boxes, too, larger ones, with expensive store labels and fresh gift tags in my mother's handwriting. For a moment, I stood there looking at them on my porch and understood what bothered me. They did not look like an apology. They looked like terms. Susan had texted first to say she wanted to make Christmas right. I carried the boxes inside but did not put them in Sophie's room. When she came home from school, I told her what Grandma had sent and asked whether she wanted to look at them. Sophie stood in the living room for a while, staring at the watercolor set she had wanted so badly in December. Then she picked up one of the original packages, turned it over in her hands, and placed it back on the table. "I don't want them," she said. I asked whether she was sure, because I did not want my anger making a decision for her. She nodded. They weren't gifts anymore. I understood immediately. A gift was supposed to make the person receiving it feel loved. Those boxes had already been used to tell my daughter exactly where she ranked. I did not donate them in some dramatic gesture or send pictures to my mother. I moved the boxes into the spare room and left them there until Susan decided what she wanted done with them. Sophie had made her choice, and that was enough. What mattered to me was that she had been allowed to make it herself. For years, adults in my family had treated children as pieces on a board while insisting everything was being done for them. I was done repeating that pattern even when I believed my own decision would be the better one. 3 days later, James asked me to meet him at the office after most of the staff had gone home. Susan came with him, which told me immediately that the conversation would not be limited to business. My father had prepared a folder. Inside was a proposal for a college account for Sophie, a revised version of the continuity plan, and several handwritten notes about repairing the family. He began by saying nobody wanted the situation to continue, and that we had all had enough time to cool down. Susan added that Sophie deserved to have grandparents and cousins without being caught in adult conflict, as though Sophie had somehow wandered into a fight instead of being deliberately placed at the center of one. James moved quickly to what he called a practical solution. The outside accountant was nearing the end of the related party reconciliation. He wanted me to agree that once the corrected schedule was completed, I would sign the lender certification without further delay. That part was reasonable. I told him I had always intended to sign once I could truthfully certify the package. He seemed relieved until I pointed to the rest of his proposal. He also wanted me to stop opposing the continuity plan after a few wording changes, agree not to broaden the Christmas issue beyond people he considered necessary, and treat the remaining dispute as a private family matter. Susan leaned forward. "Your father is trying to give Sophie something substantial for her future." I looked at the college account proposal. "Then give it to her without asking for anything from me." Her mouth tightened. James said that was not how compromise worked. I told him that was exactly the problem. The lender certification was a professional responsibility. My shareholder vote belonged to me. Sophie's relationship with her grandparents belonged to Sophie. Christmas was a factual event that had already become relevant because he had used it to accuse me of retaliation before the board. Combining those things into one package did not create peace. It created leverage. James tapped the folder with one finger. "You're getting everything you said you wanted. The gifts are back. Your mother is willing to apologize. Sophie gets a college account. You keep your position. What exactly are you still fighting for?" That question told me he still thought the argument was about compensation. "I'm not fighting for more," I said. "I'm refusing to trade one decision for another. If the financial statements are correct, I'll certify them. I'm not signing a continuity plan I don't support because you attach money for my daughter to it." Susan accused me of making forgiveness impossible. I told her forgiveness was not on the agenda of a corporate meeting, and if she wanted to apologize to Sophie someday, the apology could not arrive with conditions attached. I left the folder on the table. By then, the special meeting was less than 3 weeks away, and I knew James intended to make the same argument in front of a larger room. His position was that a Christmas disagreement had spilled into the business because I could not separate emotion from responsibility. I had no interest in answering that with a speech about how much my family had hurt me. If I wanted the room to understand what had actually happened, I needed chronology. I started with the financial side. The fiscal year had ended before Christmas. The lender package was already being prepared. The related party schedule had raised questions before I left my parents' house. I placed the transaction pattern beside the formal review scope, the outside accountant's findings to date, and James's board email accusing me of retaliation. Then I added the continuity plan version history showing that my consent had been required before Christmas and that the final voting schedule had deliberately been held until after the holiday meeting. The emotional evidence went into a separate section because I refused to let it contaminate the accounting record. Susan had asked for Sophie's wish list. She had purchased gifts specifically for her. She had told Allison before Christmas not to interfere when those gifts were moved. Then she had written, "Marissa will do the rest herself," followed by the message about everyone finally seeing what happened if I grabbed anything from the children. The screenshots Allison had sent me were powerful, but independent counsel wanted something stronger before they were used in the special meeting. Allison brought her phone into counsel's office the following week. I was there only for the portion involving the records relevant to the meeting. She opened the original thread herself. The dates matched. The messages matched. Counsel preserved an export and documented that Allison confirmed the conversation was authentic and unaltered. She looked sick while doing it, but she did not take back what she had already admitted. Susan had told her something was going to happen, and Allison had chosen not to stop it. Then counsel asked about the Christmas video. My mother surprised everyone by volunteering it. Susan had kept the recording because she still believed it helped her. She told counsel it showed me becoming upset, abruptly taking Sophie away, and destroying what should have been a family holiday over presents. James supported her description. Neither of them seemed to understand that the usefulness of the recording had never depended on whether I left angry. It depended on what happened before I left. The clip began several minutes before the first present changed hands. I watched my mother adjust the phone on the shelf and step back to check the frame. Allison's children gathered near the tree. Sophie sat slightly apart from them. Susan picked up a box, looked directly at the tag with Sophie's name, and handed it to one of the cousins. Then another. Then another. My own voice came through the recording, calm and clear. "Mom, are those Sophie's gifts?" Susan gave the answer I remembered. "These are for our real grandkids." I heard James say, "Marissa, calm down." Nothing in my voice before that had been loud. Susan followed with, "Please don't make a scene in front of the children." On the recording, I was standing still. Then came the moment when I looked toward the phone. Even months later, I recognized the exact change in my face. I did not suddenly become furious. I became careful. I walked to the entryway, got Sophie's coat, helped her put it on, and told my parents that Sophie did not need to stay there. James accused me of ruining Christmas over presents. I did not threaten the company. I did not mention the continuity plan. I did not grab anything from another child. I took my daughter and left. When the clip ended, Susan immediately began explaining that my calmness was deceptive because she knew how angry I could become later. Counsel did not argue with her. He simply asked permission to preserve the video with the other meeting materials. Susan agreed because she was still convinced context would save her. It did the opposite. The next morning, counsel sent a draft chronology for factual review. Susan's planning messages came first, then Christmas. Then my internal certification hold later that night. Then the formal reconciliation request after the office reopened. Then James's board email accusing me of using a family dispute to retaliate against Allison. Seeing those events stacked in order changed the entire shape of his accusation. I had not created a business dispute because I was angry about Christmas. Susan had planned the Christmas confrontation before my review existed, and James had used that confrontation afterward to explain away questions that were already supported by company records. The chronology did not prove he knew every detail of Susan's plan. I still refused to claim that. It did prove that his version of cause and effect was backwards. By the end of February, the accountant completed the corrected related party schedule. Some expenses were legitimate. Some required allocation. Some were unsupported personal benefits that would have to be addressed separately. With the schedule corrected and disclosed, I signed the lender certification on February 27th, exactly as I had always said I would. I did not hold my signature hostage after the facts were ready because my objective had never been to damage the company. That left only the continuity plan. The night before the special meeting, I was reviewing the chronology one last time when a text from James appeared on my phone. He did not mention the lender, the expenses, or the board. He wrote, "Tomorrow, you're going to decide whether you still have a family." I read it once, turned my phone face down, and went upstairs to say goodnight to Sophie. The special meeting began at 9 on March 5th. By then, the corrected lender certification had already been submitted, so James could no longer claim I was holding the company hostage. The 5 board members sat around the long conference table, with our outside accountant and independent counsel along one side. Several senior leaders were there because the review had begun affecting policies they would eventually have to implement. Susan sat beside my father as a shareholder, not a director. Allison sat across from me with a folder unopened in front of her. Nobody looked comfortable, which was probably appropriate. Comfortable rooms had protected my family for too long. James opened the meeting the way I expected him to. He talked about the business he had built, the employees who depended on us, and the responsibility we had to keep private disagreements from threatening 30 years of work. Then he reached Christmas without saying Sophie's name. An emotional family incident spilled into the company, he said. What followed was an unnecessary escalation that damaged trust in leadership. He never accused me of falsifying numbers or violating a policy. He did not need to. His argument depended on something simpler. I had been hurt. Therefore, everything I did afterward could be dismissed as the behavior of a hurt daughter. When he finished, I did not defend myself. I opened the chronology independent counsel had prepared and started with dates. Our fiscal year ended November 30th. The lender compliance package was already in preparation before Christmas. Questions on the related party schedule existed before December 25th. On Christmas night, I marked the certification pending because the schedule had not been reconciled. When the office reopened, accounting preserved the supporting records and the outside accountant became involved. The lender later granted an extension. On February 27th, after the corrected schedule was completed, I signed the certification exactly as I had said I would. No threat. No refusal after the facts were ready. No attempt to trade my signature for anything. James interrupted once to say the review would never have become so aggressive if Christmas had not happened. Helen, one of the independent directors, asked him to let me finish. I moved to the continuity plan. The draft required 80% shareholder approval. James, Susan, and Allison together controlled 75%. My consent had always been necessary. The version history showed that the final voting schedule was deliberately held until after Christmas. I did not claim that proved James knew what Susan intended to do with Sophie's gifts. It did not. I simply said the record showed that my cooperation mattered before the holiday and that the full proposal was kept from me until afterward. Then our outside accountant walked through the review findings available at that stage. Most of the expenses examined were legitimate business charges. Some mixed-purpose travel had valid company components that needed to be separated from personal portions. Several items lacked enough support to remain classified as business expenses in full. More important than any one charge was the control problem. Family relationships had repeatedly influenced how approvals were handled. Verbal directions from James, informal pressure involving Susan, and exceptions surrounding Allison's department had softened controls that existed on paper. He did not call it theft. He did not call anyone a criminal. He said the related party process had not been reliable enough for me to certify the original schedule without correction. That mattered more than an accusation would have. James could fight accusations. Facts were less cooperative. He tried anyway. He said family-owned companies often operated with informal practices and that nobody had intended to mislead anyone. I agreed that informal did not automatically mean improper. Then I placed his board email on the screen. It had been sent less than an hour after I temporarily suspended Allison's expense privileges in January. In it, James had described my action as retaliation caused by a private family dispute. I acknowledged again that the temporary suspension had been too unilateral and that I had corrected it the next day by moving related party approvals to independent review. I had already admitted that mistake. What mattered now was the story James had attached to it. You said my financial decisions were caused by Christmas, I told him. So if Christmas is part of your explanation for my conduct, the chronology of Christmas matters. Susan shifted in her chair before James could answer. This is ridiculous. Christmas was not some scheme. I was trying to make a point about how Marissa treats this family. Independent counsel looked toward her. Susan, you are not required to address the family communications, but because authenticated messages involving you are included in the meeting materials, if you want to explain their context, you may. That invitation was the easiest thing Susan could have declined. She did not. She leaned forward and said the messages had been taken out of context. She had been tired of watching me undermine Allison and wanted me to see what it felt like when everything was not centered on Sophie. She insisted she never intended to hurt anyone. Counsel asked whether she disputed sending the messages Allison had authenticated. Susan said she did not dispute the words, only the interpretation. The first message appeared on the screen. Don't interfere when I move Sophie's presents. Marissa will do the rest herself. Susan immediately said that meant I would probably become angry and make another family gathering miserable. The second message appeared beneath it. If she grabs anything from the kids, everyone will finally see it. The room became completely quiet. Susan looked around as though silence were simply another audience she could persuade. You have to understand what Marissa is like when she thinks Allison's children are getting something Sophie isn't. I wanted people to see the pattern. Helen asked, so you deliberately moved gifts labeled for an 11-year-old child because you expected her mother to react badly? Susan shook her head. That makes it sound cruel. Helen did not raise her voice. I'm asking whether that is what happened. Susan started explaining that Sophie had plenty, that my parents had always been generous, that gifts were not what Christmas was supposed to be about, and that I had been poisoning family relationships for years by counting everything. Every sentence was supposed to make her look more reasonable. Each one made the original act harder to excuse. Counsel then played the short Christmas clip Susan herself had preserved. Watching it in that room felt different from watching it weeks earlier. There were no memories filling the gaps now. Only sequence. Susan checking the camera angle. Sophie sitting beside the tree. My mother reading Sophie's name on the tag and deliberately handing the box to one of Allison's children. Then another. Then another. My recorded voice asked, "Mom, are those Sophie's gifts?" Susan answered, "These are for our real grandkids." James's voice came next. "Marissa, calm down." I had not raised my voice. Then Susan said, "Please don't make a scene in front of the children." On the screen, I was standing still. A few seconds later, I looked at the phone, got Sophie's coat, and left. No threat against the company. No attempt to take anything from Allison's children. No screaming. The outburst Susan had predicted in writing never happened. When the clip stopped, my father said, "I didn't know she planned it like that." I believed it was possible. I had never found evidence showing James helped design Susan's Christmas plan, and I was not going to invent proof because the room was finally listening to me. "I can't prove you knew the details," I said. "I'm not claiming you did." James looked almost relieved. Then I continued. "What I can prove is that after it happened, you used it immediately. You told the board I was retaliating because of a family dispute. You used Christmas to explain away financial questions that later turned out to require a formal correction." His expression changed again. "Because the timing looked retaliatory, and when independent review replaced my unilateral decision, you kept making the same argument. You were angry." "Yes," I said. "Being angry doesn't make an invoice disappear." That was the only line I needed. The meeting moved back to governance, which was where James had always been strongest. He said that even if mistakes had been made, the continuity plan was still the best way to preserve the business. He looked toward Allison when he said it. "We need to stop tearing apart the future because of old resentments." Allison finally opened the folder in front of her. James told her they had spent months building a structure that protected her children. He reminded her that she had supported it from the beginning. Allison nodded slowly. "I did." Susan reached for her arm. Allison moved it away. Then Allison looked at the rest of us and said, "Mom told me not to interfere on Christmas. I knew she was going to make some kind of point with Sophie's gifts. I didn't know everything she had planned, but I knew enough to stop it." I asked, "And you didn't?" She looked directly at me. No, there was no apology attached to it. No excuse about pressure. I appreciated that more than another speech would have impressed me. James immediately tried to move past it. "Then you made a mistake. We all did. That has nothing to do with the continuity plan." Allison turned to him. "Who controls the supervisory voting rights?" James's face tightened. "We already discussed that." "No, you explained why the structure was good for my kids. I'm asking who controls the votes while you and Mom hold the supervisory rights." "The family controls them." Allison stared at him. "That wasn't my question." For the first time that morning, James had no smooth answer ready. The advisor had already explained the structure in earlier meetings. Under the current draft, James and Susan would retain significant supervisory control for years. Allison's branch received future benefits and a privileged position, but not the independence she had assumed came with them. My refusal had always prevented the plan from reaching the 80% threshold. Allison's vote was not suddenly the missing legal key. What changed in that room was something else. She closed the folder. "I'm not supporting this plan anymore. And I'm not signing an amendment built around a structure where you keep telling me I'm being given control while reserving the right to control me." Susan whispered her name. Allison did not look at her. James stared at his younger daughter as if she had violated a law older than anything in our bylaws. For years, he had treated 75% as almost enough because Allison's 25% had never seemed independent from his own. That morning, he finally saw the difference between influence and ownership. the board moved into the decisions we could legally make that day. The continuity plan was formally shelved because it did not have the required shareholder consent. Then, Helen introduced an interim resolution limiting James's unilateral authority over financial approvals until the outside accountant issued the final review report. Major related party and discretionary financial decisions would require an independent approval alongside management. James voted no. I voted yes. Both independent directors voted yes. Then everyone looked at Allison. She stared at the resolution for several seconds before raising her hand. Yes. 4 votes to 1. The second resolution scheduled a final leadership vote after the review report was completed. James would remain Chief Executive Officer for the moment, but he would no longer be able to approve sensitive financial decisions alone. The meeting ended without applause, shouting, or anyone being escorted from the building. People closed laptops, gathered folders, and left quietly. Susan walked out without speaking to me. Allison stayed seated until almost everyone else had gone. My father remained at the head of the table, surrounded by the same company documents he had spent years treating as extensions of his own authority. For most of my life, James had believed the family moved as long as he could keep one daughter obedient and the other one fighting him. That morning, neither of us did what he expected. And for the first time since he founded Clark Commercial Supply, my father was still the CEO, but he was no longer the only person controlling what happened next. The final review report arrived 11 days after the special meeting. By then, James was still technically Chief Executive Officer, but the restrictions approved by the board meant he could no longer authorize sensitive related party spending on his own. He hated the arrangement and made sure everyone knew it, yet the company kept running. Orders went out, employees got paid, customers never knew there was a family war happening above them. That mattered because one of my father's favorite arguments had always been that questioning him would destroy what he built. Instead, the business functioned perfectly well while people checked his decisions. The report was less dramatic than Susan had predicted and more damaging than James wanted. It did not accuse anyone of stealing millions of dollars. It documented something harder for him to dismiss: years of inconsistent controls, unsupported personal portions of mixed expenses, verbal overrides involving James, informal pressure from Susan despite her having no company authority, and repeated exceptions concentrated around Allison's department. Several charges were reclassified, and Allison agreed to repay the portions that could not be supported as legitimate company expenses. Others were treated through the appropriate compensation and tax process. The accountants did not call our family corrupt. They simply showed that family status had been allowed to change how company rules were applied. The board met again near the end of March. This time, there was no Christmas video and no argument about my temperament. Helen introduced the governance recommendations directly. Related party approvals would permanently require independent oversight. Susan would have no authority to contact accounting staff or represent the company at business events unless formally invited. Allison's loosely defined director position would end, although she would keep the shares that legally belonged to her. Most importantly, the board would vote on whether James should remain Chief Executive Officer after repeatedly allowing personal relationships to override company controls and then attempting to dismiss legitimate financial concerns as a family grievance. James spoke for almost 20 minutes. He reminded everyone that he had founded the company when none of us knew whether it would survive its first year. He talked about payrolls he had covered personally, customers he had won by shaking hands instead of sending contracts, and sacrifices Susan had made while he worked nights and weekends. Everything he said about those years was probably true. The problem was that none of it answered the question in front of us. Building something did not give him permanent permission to govern it however he wanted, after other people owned part of it too. The vote to remove him as Chief Executive Officer passed 4-1. James voted for himself. Allison voted with the independent directors and me. I watched my father absorb the number without moving. Losing the continuity plan had angered him. Losing unilateral financial authority had insulted him. Losing the job he believed was inseparable from his identity was different. For the first time, he could not turn toward Susan, Allison, or me and make one of us fix the outcome. Afterwards, Susan found me outside the conference room. She looked exhausted rather than furious. "Are you happy now?" she asked. Everyone thinks I'm some kind of monster. Months earlier, I might have explained that I had never wanted any of this. I might have listed every chance they had been given to stop. Instead, I said, I didn't tell them who you are. I stopped helping you tell them who I am. She stared at me, waiting for more, but I had nothing else to give her. Allison's consequences were quieter. She lost the salary attached to the position our father had created for her and had to make a repayment arrangement for the unsupported expenses tied to her responsibility. She asked me once whether I could help her find another role inside the company. I told her no. Not because I wanted her punished forever, but because rescuing her would simply rebuild the same system with me in our parents' place. You can start over, I told her, but you can't start over on my back. She did not like hearing it. A week later, she called to tell me she understood. The board asked whether I would take over as chief executive officer. A year earlier, I would have considered that the ultimate proof that I had won. By then it felt like another trap, only a more flattering one. I agreed to remain through the transition and help recruit an experienced outside CEO. I kept my shares, my professional standing, and my seat at the table. What I refused was the idea that the only satisfying ending required me to sit in my father's chair. Sophie never accepted the Christmas gifts. My mother eventually had them collected from my house. Sophie did not ask where they went. She had stopped measuring her place in the family by what Susan gave her, and I had stopped asking her to maintain relationships simply because blood made adults uncomfortable with distance. She still asked questions sometimes, especially about whether Grandma and Grandpa would ever apologize properly. I told her I did not know. For once, I was comfortable admitting that. When I look back now, the part I remember most clearly is not the board vote or my father's face when he lost control of the company. It is Sophie, standing in my parents' living room with empty hands while adults waited for me to explode. They believed hurting my daughter would make me predictable. Instead, it finally made me careful. I stopped fighting for their approval, stopped absorbing consequences to keep everyone comfortable, and stopped confusing access to my life with a right to control it. My parents lost power because they believed family loyalty meant nobody would ever force them to follow the same rules as everyone else. In the end, all I did was stop making that belief true. When family uses love, money, or loyalty to control you, boundaries become protection, not cruelty. You should verify facts, document patterns, and make decisions you can defend after anger fades. Protect children from repeated disrespect, and never trade self-respect for temporary peace. Subscribe for more family drama stories and lessons.